Good evening, everyone, and welcome. My name's Sarah, and I'll be your moderator this evening. And I'm pleased to be joined by Kate Macdonald and our guest speaker, Melissa Edmundson. The talk will be about 45 minutes and then followed by a 15-minute Q&A. So there is a box for you to put your questions in, and then we'll try and answer all of them towards the end. So now, without further ado, I will pass over to Kate and Melissa and enjoy women writers and supernatural short stories.
Thank you, Sarah. So, welcome all.
I'm Kate Macdonald. I run Handheld Press, and this is Melissa Edmundson speaking to us from South Carolina. And I'm pretty sure that in Britain it's a wee bit hotter than South Carolina could possibly be, because Melissa's actually got sleeves on. I could not conceive of wearing sleeves at the moment, it's so hot. What we're going to be talking about is women writers of supernatural short stories based around these two amazing books. This one we already have published, and this one will come out on the 9th of August by K Broster. But we're going to stray into other territory as well as the conversation takes us. So what I'd like to start with is where does all this begin? So Melissa, can you tell us how your interest in classic supernatural women's fiction began? Where did that come from?
That came, a couple of decades ago now, in graduate school when I started my PhD dissertation and discovered it was sort of surprisingly an area that had not received a lot of attention. And again, I'm talking about, about 20 years ago now. So, but it was still a surprise to me that a lot of these women were not as well known. Their stories had not really been talked about all that much, and especially critical, but also popular conversations regarding the supernatural. So I completed a PhD dissertation and sort of went from there. And in reading these authors, it was sort of like a snowball. You find more as you read more. So that's sort of where everything got started. And I just, personally, still again, 20 years plus on, I still just absolutely love reading, short stories, ghost stories by women.
So what were your sources? How did you manage to find one and then another one led to another? I mean, what was the trail of little breadcrumbs that led you to the stories?
Was really, in my early research, I really wanted to sort of provide a lot of scope for women's writing, especially that was mostly focused. My early research was focused on the 19th century, Victorian, but also into, romantic, into the early parts of the 19th century. And really my research started with poetry, ballads by women that featured really strong women characters, strong, fighting against these forces and having a real social element. So that's sort of where I coined the phrase, the social supernatural, to sort of describe, how women, I saw this pattern of how women were using the supernatural, I thought in sort of new and different ways. So I wanted to show that kind of breadth and depth of it. So, early ballads, poetry, Anne Bannerman and Charlotte Daker. Her novels of Floya might be, familiar to some people. So I started there, but really women's use of the supernatural for political purposes, for social purposes, actually goes back about a century before that. So this is really a long established tradition. And then from that, I, kept going into the Victorian era, started to find, short stories, and I'm still going and still building because I keep moving up now with these recent handheld editions, moving into the 20th century and finding so much good material to talk about with women's use of the supernatural.
Yeah. So what's the pattern that you spoke of? You said there was a pattern that became quite obvious in how women used the supernatural short story. What were they using and how does it manifest?
I think it's interesting to look at, how women use the supernatural to really critique how women are treated in life, as they're living, when they're living, especially kind of that, looking at an area of victimhood in a lot of ways, but really complicating, like we have that in our mind, what it means to be a victim, which means different things, to different people at different times, but really critiquing the treatment of women. And then what's so interesting, especially in some of the earlier romantic literature, and then into the Victorian period as well, is that women writers tend to bring back women as revenants, right? As these the return, the forceful return. And they're not sort of, they complicate our notions of ghosts because they're not just sort of, flitting around. They have a purpose. And I think that's really key, and that's really central in these stories, that the ghost always has a purpose for coming back. And it's usually to avenge, to revenge, to right some wrong that was done to these women. So these women become very powerful after their death. They can't be that type of force. And again, that gets into the societal issues of how women were expected to be, right? So really that purpose in coming back was something that just struck me from the very beginning. It's just, something very, very, I feel like unique with women's stories.
And I know that many of these stories first appeared in Victorian magazines and penny dreadfuls and so on. But when did they start getting collected in anthologies?
That was something too. I mean, we have the rise definitely of the Victorian Periodical, which, women used very, very well. They used that to their benefit. Financially, yes, a lot of these women were supporting, large families. They were supporting, partners and husbands in a lot of ways, in a lot of situations. So they definitely used it financially to make a living, but they also used it professionally as, to make their names. And even going back to someone like Charles Dickens, who everyone knows, and his periodicals, Household Words and All the Year Round, they typically, had a lot of women writers writing ghost stories. Rosa Mulholland, Elizabeth Gaskell, some of the maybe bigger names in the genre got their start, writing for these Victorian periodicals. You don't have as much of the anthologies until, I don't want to generalize too much, but a little bit later, towards the turn of the 20th century. But what you did have during the 19th century was women collecting their own work and publishing them. So you would have, Edith Nesbit, or E. Nesbit, as she published under, Amelia B. Edwards, writing these stories in magazines, and then being very, I think, savvy business wise in collecting these stories in collections. Rosa Mulholland did that as well. I could again just go on and on, but I think another way that women saw these stories, that they were a financial and professional, they offered these advantages that they didn't. So again, they're using that kind of quote unquote light, entertainment, the ghost story, the fun thing to read. And then I think that's how it connects back to that social element, that they knew they had the readership. So then they used these stories to sort of, subtly and not so subtly, directly and indirectly put in these social critiques, within the stories themselves.
And they had a captive audience, they had a fan base. And in the early 20th century, we come into what Mike Ashley calls the Silver Age of story magazines, periodicals, which were, as you say, extraordinarily lucrative, because an author could sell a story to 2 or 3 separate magazines, which would be syndicated again and again, and then they could collect the story in an anthology. So that single story would do work 4 or 5 times over if they were successful. It was such a clever way to earn money. And a short story doesn't take that long to write, whereas a novel takes a huge amount of time and may not bring you the return. So it was a perfect medium, really. It was such a clever thing to do. So when we started putting things together, yes, I was reviewing a book called The Palgrave Book of British Weird. And I started thinking, where are the women? Because there were no women authors discussed in that book. And I think it was at that point I got back in touch with you, because you and I had already collaborated on a much earlier project when I was still a working academic. And I had this vague idea that you did supernatural as well as Indian colonial studying. So I think I said to you, Melissa, I'd like to commission an anthology of weird fiction by women. What have you got? And you said, here is my shopping list. And you already had a list already set up. And it was the same for the sequel, Women's Weird too. You had a list of stories that you really wanted to get out there. So had you been collecting these hoping that an anthology might be possible? Or did you just think, I have a huge amount of material and it didn't take that long to put the anthology together?
Yeah, that's a great question. I had a lot of research material built up from the book that I had done. So my dissertation turned into a book that was published in 2013, British women's ghost literature in 19th century Britain, published by University of Wales Press. But there was a lot of research again that I had collected. So, I kind of put that to the side and did other things, I guess really Alice Perrin, I'm going back kind of mentally in my mind thinking she was really, and I paused a little bit because I feel a little bit guilty. She didn't make it into,
No,
she didn't make it into the 2013 book. I chose B.M. Croker, Bithia Mary Croker instead, because she fit. I did an imperialism chapter, which again, that's a whole other thing. That's a whole other talk maybe. Women were really, really interested in critiquing the British imperial presence and the empire. But so Alice Perrin didn't make it into, but I had sort of, just was kind of taken by her work, her Anglo-Indian, again, sort of that bridge, the Anglo-Indian ghost stories that she focused on, that she wrote when she, for decades she lived in India. And she was really the first person that I said, okay, this writer really deserves to have a collection. So again, that was my first collection that I did in 2011 for Victorian Secrets Publishing for Catherine Pope, who runs that. And she was very receptive to it. She was sort of doing, kind of reclaiming with a really focus on Victorian. So that was my first one. And since then I did another collection with her of sort of the greatest hits maybe of some of my favorite ghost stories in 2018. But like I said, you read about one writer and then you find 3 or 4 more. So you mentioned the list that I have, and that was a very, I think, selective list that I gave you, because I really held back, and I think I only gave you like 20 names.
Only 20, yes.
Yeah, it was something like that. And my list, though, I have this like running list, and I'm well over 200.
Oh my goodness.
And I'm on my way to, I'm well over 200 authors, probably getting close to 250. And I, even within the past, couple of years, I've added to that list tremendously.
My goodness.
It just keeps growing. It keeps growing. And there's still, by no means is this, this is like the tip of the iceberg, as they say.
I think in your original list, we did have a bit of a tug of war over some of the authors you wanted to go in to the first Women's Weird anthology. But I think one of the very top stars was Helen de Guerry Simpson with Young Magic. I mean, that hit me between the eyes. It was just an astounding piece of work, and several reviewers picked out Young Magic by Helen Simpson as being one of the standout stories in that collection. So that was why we decided we need to do a complete collection of Helen Simpson. Her being out of copyright was, of course, a huge advantage for me, because that means we don't pay royalties, which can make a difference, especially for an unknown author, because Helen de Guerry Simpson is completely unknown. So for marketing her, please buy an anthology of short stories, which isn't always such a great sell, by an author you've never heard of from a really long time ago. that is hard to sell. So doing it without having to pay royalties, okay, we can go with this. And yeah, and then we just put together this really, really lovely collection by Helen, The Outcast and the Rite. So Helen Simpson, what about Helen was special for you when you first came across her? What was your first, do you remember anything about your first responses to her writing?
Yeah, I just think she's, and I don't want to say this because, if I keep saying it's going to, lose force, but she was sort of unlike anyone that I had read before. Her stories, there's just this sort of I'll kind of go at it this way. One reviewer called her stories evasive, which I think is interesting. So I think, and maybe elusive might be another way of looking at it. And I think I included that quote. If you do get, if you have the edition, I included that quote from the contemporary reviewer. But I think that's what really sort of grabbed my attention. I mean, again, like you said, in the first two volumes of Women's Weird, we did have to make some difficult decisions because one of them was actually royalties, which can add up, and, but another thing was just, there were so many, and we wanted to include a good scope and just, show you what Women's Weird can actually do, what it is. So, having a lot of competition for those, those slots in the anthology, that's how I feel like, I just felt that Simpson was doing something so different from other writers, still in that, in the weird, supernatural, kind of those nebulous terms, but it was just something where you're trying to, she's like, she gives impressions of things. That's how I like to think of her too. It's like these impressions of things in her stories, and you're not quite shown like everything as a reader. And I think that's really what that quality really grabbed me. And I think Young Magic was one, and I think you agreed with me as well. There's a quality in that story where it's quiet and it's ominous, and she kind of, lures you in, and just
then
the
it's
pacing,
terrifying.
and, the characterization, the pacing, everything, the plotting is just wonderful. But, she's almost like pulling you into the sense of, okay, I'm supposed to think something's off here, but I feel okay about it until she starts to kind of ramp up that energy. And then by the end, spoiler free here, but by the end, it's just this kind of, oh, I knew something was going to happen, right? I was prepared for it as a reader, but she still surprises you.
Yeah, you weren't prepared for that, the thing that happens. And also the implications as well. I mean, her stories, they make you work. You really have to read and think, okay, what am I not being told? What is this really, really frightening and unsettling element that I have to work out myself? And that really is clever, because it makes the story becomes unbounded except by the limitations of the reader's imagination. And there are millions of readers. So you can imagine almost anything from these slight, delicate hints. I mean, you are led down a path. You are told the story. This is the way the narrative is going. This happened and that happened and this happened. But it's the why and the how that you are kind of left with, not so much colouring in happening. You're left with the vague, delicate outline. And she's just so good. I mean, I still think about those stories. I will lie in bed awake and think, well, how did that actually work? What was the technical expertise that made her do this with this particular aspect of the story? No, she was just brilliant. And
I absolutely agree. And that's the thing, again, with her stories, she doesn't give you these sort of neat endings, right? That are kind of tied up in a bow. And that's, I don't really prefer, and again, personally speaking, right, that's the great thing about this genre, is everyone likes something a little bit different. Like, we all like the same thing, but we like it for different reasons, right? And we're scared by different things, again, because of our own personal fears, right, and anxiety. So we bring so much, personal things to these stories. But one of the things personally that I really enjoy are stories that are open-ended. At the end, and there's, a fine line. There's sometimes it's, okay, is this a little bit, when you read stories, is lazy, right? They're not going to tie everything up because they don't want to, right? They don't want to spend the time doing it. But when it's done well, you have those questions, and she just always leaves you wanting more. And like you said, you come back to these stories after you read them, and you think about them in different ways. And
Yeah.
did I read that right? Is that how I'm supposed to see this, or maybe
Yeah.
not? And those
Yeah.
questions that you're left with, I think, are just, they're fascinating, and they make the story so interesting. Yeah.
And she is so modern. I should stress here, we began talking about your research in the early Victorian and mid-Victorian period, but Helen de Guerry Simpson is absolutely 1920s, 1930s. I mean, it would be wrong to call her modernist, but I think some of the evasion and some of the ellipses, the words that are not spoken, the words that are not written down, I do think that comes from modernist influence, when they are expecting you to do more work and to read fiction in a completely different way. But yet she is absolutely readable. She's not messing around with, how can I say this? She's not messing around with pretentiousness. She's not expecting you to know huge amounts about this or that cultural anomaly. She's telling you a story, but it's the way she tells it. It's remarkable. It's so modern.
Yeah. And that's one of the things. Yeah. No, I'm sorry. I just think, again, that's one of the rewarding aspects of these, collections that are more into the 20th century, is that, a lot of times people will say, well, they'll talk about the Victorian era. Like that's, the ghost story sort of began and ended there, and it did not, it began before, and it definitely kept going. I mean, again, more and more of these stories that we uncover, the 20s, the 30s, the interwar period was a golden age, for, to use that term, for the ghost story, for the supernatural, for the weird, for the gothic, whatever you want to say. And yeah, it does, it's rewarding, because you see something, like you said, I totally agree, Simpson is modern, and this collection is very much grounded in the modern, in the 20th century. But it shows, it shows the continuance of this, tradition. I don't feel like there's a lot of Victorian that creeps in, and in a lot of these 20th century stories, you'll see there's the Victorian, right? It's creeping in, whether they're using it, a satirical way or not, it's there. These stories are very modern.
Yeah. And it's not just things like modern technology is used and modern modes of thinking are used. It's also, even in a story which is set in possibly the Edwardian period, and maybe set a little further back in time, these characters are absolutely relatable humans of today, Helen's day. And it's the way they think and the way they interact. The Victorian tropes simply don't occur, which she's just marvelous. I think we should move on to D.K. Broster, otherwise we'll run out of time. So D.K. Broster, for those of you who didn't grow up in Scotland, D.K. Broster may not be that much of a great name, but for those of us who did grow up in Scotland, D.K. Broster was on every bookshop shelf for historical fiction. She was in all the libraries, and she was, I'm pretty sure, taught in for hire, education system. The exam you take when you're 17 is the hire, and with hires you leave school. I'm pretty sure that at least two of her novels, The Gleam in the North and The Dark Mile, were taught, part of the curriculum, because she wrote about the 1745 Jacobite uprising or rebellion, depending on which side of the political divide you are, which is extremely important in Scottish culture. She was a historical novelist, and she wrote about the Jacobites, and she also wrote about the French Revolution, because she adored anything from the 18th century. Like Georgette Hare, she wrote superbly about men in wigs and women in hoops and patches and hair powder. It's possible that she was heavily influenced by the Scarlet Pimpernel's author, whose name has momentarily disappeared from my mind. Melissa, who wrote the
Baroness D'Orsay, right?
Baroness D'Orsay, yes. And also, there's a couple of very obscure British authors who also, at the same time as Baroness D'Orsay, wrote about the powder and patch, if you like, the French Revolution, the pre-revolutionary society. Anyway, be that as it may, D.K. Broster went to Oxford, and during the Second World War, she did nursing. She was a secretary to the head of the history department at Oxford. So she had a pretty sound training in history, and she wrote historical novels. But at the same time, she wrote these absolutely extraordinary, supernatural, very weird short stories from 1907 through to 1945. That's the range that we have chosen. I don't think she wrote much after 45, did she? When did she die? I don't know.
1950.
1950.
Yeah.
So
Mhm.
she was approaching the end of her life when the last story we've republished came out. So we have pretty much the whole range of her writing career. So why do you think she wrote these incredible supernatural short stories, as well as the historical fiction?
That's a good question.
Because I don't know.
And that's another interesting part of looking into Broster's life. She was, I think, by all accounts, a very private person. I wouldn't say necessarily she was reclusive, because she did do talks and she liked to travel. During the Second World War, she did charity, events and things like that. So she and donations and things. So, but she was very private.
Yeah.
So again, it's interesting to have these two. I'm just kind of looking down. These two authors here side by side. It's interesting because Simpson was very much a people person. She absolutely loved to be kind of out. She gave lots of interviews. Being from Australia, she got a lot of attention in the Australian media. So I had all this to pull from, all these interviews and
she was so active in like the detection club. She worked with Clemson. She was best friends with Dorothy L. Sayers. She had a big range of life interests to draw on. But yet, Broster, we know nothing. We know so little.
I was actually amazed because I think I told you, I was like, I don't know how long this intro, because you always give me like that cap, and I was like, oh, I don't know if I'm going to be able to get there or not, because but I challenged myself, and I have to say with Broster, she's one of the maybe more recognizable women writers, to go that angle. That I think there might be more people. I could be wrong. Because I'm always surprised that a lot of people have not heard of Edith Nesbit, for instance. I'm like, oh, I can't believe, but I think Broster might be a little bit more well known because she's been anthologized a little bit more.
Exactly, yeah.
But with her biography, there was just not a lot. I was really glad that I was able to put in that she edited the Fritillary in Oxford, because I don't think anyone had put that in yet. So I was like, oh, I found a little kind of tidbit that I could put in. But she did not really give a lot of interviews. I found an interview with her and was just, I think it was from 28 or 29. I was so happy to find an interview. Yeah. And actually the interview title is, "Who is this K Broster?" So they had the same, kind of frustration. But there's just not a lot known about her. She was pretty private. But getting back to a long way around to get back to your question, it really makes you wonder, why did she write these stories? We know that they're very much, and I talk about this in the intro, you can see her interest in history, which again, I think is sort of the angle that I took with this intro, because again, very unique that they have this interest, this fascination with history, and she's working in the supernatural and the weird with that. So that I think is very unique for her writing. But like, why was she writing these? Like, it's not just supernatural. It's not just weird. I mean, a lot of these stories, again, spoiler free, but a lot of these stories border on horror. Oh, they really take no prisoners, and they don't hold anything back. And
there are some gory stories. Yeah.
So like, what, was she trying to work something out? Did she have some sort of, subconscious thing? Did she have frustrations? Who knows what? Who knows what? It's fascinating to think about.
She clearly relished writing them, because these stories are so powerful, and she is fully immersed in the plotting, the narrative, the characterization, beautifully economically drawn. With a few words, you have the characters stepping off the page, and yet you have some of the stories, you have this progression of events which leads to sheer horror. I mean, there is certainly one story I can think of in which blood is splashed so liberally it never goes away. It's absolutely extraordinary. I did wonder, is this
Which one are you
something-
talking about?
Oh, the one
See,
about-
again, it's like,
the one
don't tell
about
me,
the
but it's like
Japanese sword.
there's so many. There are more choices. I was like, okay, which one could it be? Because there's
the
more
one
than
about
one.
the Japanese sword is the one
Yeah,
I cannot. It will not leave me. It's stained
Yeah.
me forever.
Oh yeah.
We do know that she lived with another woman for most of her adult life. And that woman also was an author. I believe she wrote gardening books, and not very many, because I looked her up in the British Library catalogue. But that gave me no help. But perhaps these two women had a shared passion for for ghost stories, which wasn't something that Broster felt she could do once she had set out in her career as a writer of historical fiction from the 18th century and kilts and so on. You can't write about ghosts for that market. So she was trying a different market and doing it as a short story. Going back to what we said earlier, it was lucrative. This could have been a way for her to make relatively fast money, and she turned out to be extraordinarily good at it. So her stories kept selling. That was, the people were very willing to accept her fiction. It's just that she didn't do very much of it compared to the novels. It is a remarkable dichotomy, the way this woman's career divided so distinctly into two quite separate streams of creative impulse. Yeah, amazing woman, and a wonderful collection. How do you think Broster compares with her peers? Or in fact, how do you think both women compare with their peers in the weird, supernatural, ghosty sort of genre?
Yeah, I mean that's a tough one, because there's so much in my head. There's so much to compare. There's so much to compare. But I mean, I'll of the two, I think they do the psychological story very well. Again, characterization is done extremely well. I feel like with both of these collections, for me, again, the stories don't tend to, like, sometimes when you get an anthology or maybe you get a single author collection, they tend to run together. Sometimes I hate to say that, but it's like, oh, which was that story? I think I kind of remember. But with these, yes, I did edit them, but I don't have any problem saying, oh yeah, that's that story, that's that character. They did this in that story, and I still remember it, or I'm still, trying to think about why they did. So characters and motives, and just like the inner workings of the mind, I really feel like these two collections, in somewhat different ways, right? Because I feel like we've talked about this a little bit, but with Simpson, I keep coming back to the word kind of quiet, in a quieter way. It's ominous. And with Broster, I feel like it's more like outdoors, if that makes sense. That's the word, like word association. It's like there's action. There's a lot of kind of, it's like more intimate, I feel like, with Simpson in some ways. And I don't want to generalize, but you see where I'm getting at.
Something. I do.
Yeah.
And Simpson wrote out of door stories too, but looking at these, you've got one which is the first one, All Souls Day. It's set on the beach at the Battle of the Vendée, in sort of a counter-revolutionary battle. So on a beach. You've got Fils d'Émigré. That was that one. All Souls Day. No, that was a different one. The Window. You've got this hideous, dreadful thing happen in a French chateau during the First World War. You've got Clairvoyance, which is the one with the Japanese sword, possibly in the garden. You've got The Pestering, which is taking place right on the doorstep of a Hampshire tea room. Couching at the door, there's an awful lot happening in the garden there. Juggernaut, you've got this dreadful machine moving up and down the slope. The Pavement is all about a Roman pavement in the middle of a field. Yes, I think you're quite right. And then there's A Taste of Pomegranates, which is Paleolithic archaeology in France, in and out of caves. With
there's just there's movement and scope. I just feel like in her stories that's maybe one of the things that does stand out to me.
She's a remarkable drawer. That's a terrible word, drawer. She depicts the outdoor conditions, many different kinds, in such a way that the outdoor settings become completely imbued with the spirit of the story. So if you consider, can I think of a story involving a rhododendron bush? Oh my goodness, the one with the Japanese sword. Or can I think of a story about a very slow running stream. It's the one about the ghost outside the tea shop because something is thrown into the river. These outdoor elements really connect strongly with the heart of the stories. Another question I had for you. She's the horror we've already touched on, but I think with Simpson, there's much more subliminal creep. And it's interesting that Broster doesn't really go for the subliminal suggestion. She just says, look, horrific situation. It might be psychological horror as well as physical gore horror or social horror, but it's there. Whereas Simpson says, well, if you look around this corner, and here's the corner, but I'm not going any further, you will then see a really appalling situation, but I let you do the seeing. It's a very, it's quite a different technique, isn't it?
Yeah. And I don't know. I mean, again, it's really interesting that these editions happened to come out when they did, with Simpson coming out in May, right? And then we have Broster coming out next month in August. But kind of having them back to back, it's sort of an interesting pairing, because it does show this, again, the scope and the range, and just again, like the two books that I have here, the two collections show that the difference in that. So I think that great point.
Although my marketing team were laughing their heads off because we were talking about summer reads in the book world. You're kind of expected to do a summer reads thing. What are your summer reads? And we went, well, we've got two collections of really terrifying stories. Which would you like on the beach? I think we'll do it differently next year. However, people may like it. I don't know. Let me look at the time. I think we should draw this to a close. Sarah, would you like to read us the questions? What have people been asking? I've been seeing little red buttons popping up and down and being wheeked away. So I think somebody's out there talking.
Yes. So firstly, we have Benita, who asks, did they tend to use their own names or take on pen names or aliases?
Interesting. I don't believe they did use aliases. What do you know about this, Melissa?
Not as many as I've come across. They would tend to use initials. So you did have, again, K Broster. Now, Helen Simpson, she went by Helen Simpson. We put in de Guerry to not confuse, right? Not to confuse matters there in modern days.
There are so many Helen Simpsons out there who are already authors.
Right,
so
but she was, again, she published from the very beginning. She published, her first novel was written on a bet that someone couldn't write. I had to throw that in because I love that fact about Helen Simpson, that someone couldn't write a novel and get it published in a month, and I think she did it in 3 weeks, and it was incredibly successful. But she always from the beginning published under Helen Simpson. It was always, and Kate, I believe this, with the historical fiction as well, it was always K Broster.
It was. I don't believe she used Dorothy Kathleen ever.
But again, it was sort of like
from the beginning.
Maybe, some people weren't sure, but I think it was sort of an open secret, this was, because she would take trips to Scotland and everyone would, oh, she's, here she comes. And she got a lot of press and publicity. But it differs. There are some I've seen that did use pseudonyms published anonymously. Again, that's what makes it sort of frustrating, because with my list of 200 plus women who wrote, I know there's lots more, out there who we might, never know because they either wrote under a pseudonym, published anonymously, things like that. They would tend to sometimes write under their husband's names. So you had, just the one that comes to mind is Charlotte Riddle, who was one of the, I would say one of the kind of best, I hate to use that term, but just most accomplished Victorian writers of supernatural, of ghost stories. And she would write under Mrs. J.H. Riddle. But there's that backfires sometimes, because I've seen some, collections refer to, they drop the Mrs. and they say J.H. Riddle, and it's not, so Nesbit,
right.
that type of thing. So,
but for Helen and K Broster, they were their own names all the time. No
Yeah.
Okay. I
So
think that
sometimes you
answers
see
that.
initials. That you see initials a lot. B.M.
Yeah.
Croker, who was in the Women's Weird. We included a story. I think I put Bithia Mary. We included her whole name for her. Ellen Montgomery. Lots.
That's true. Yeah. Okay. Thank you, Sarah. Next one, please.
We had something from William. I'm missing unfamiliar names. DK Gloucester. I think he might have meant DK Broster, who you were talking about.
Yeah.
And then we had a question from Subi. Can you please share the names of the women writers that are being discussed? So I can put.
Yeah, I mean it's on the name of the.
I can hold up my blog.
Yeah. So it should be on the Eventbrite invitation. The text, the names of the authors. What's the next question, Sarah?
This is from an anonymous person. Did Broster write the different genres under her real name, which is going back?
Yes, she did. Yeah, it was DK Broster for the supernatural, DK Broster for the historical fiction. So it's not difficult to track her works down.
Okay, and we have a lady that wants to talk. I believe Sissy. So I'm going to allow her to talk. Sissy, can you unmute yourself?
One more time. That's it. Nearly. I have to click again, Sissy. You're still muted. Now that's better.
Can you hear us?
Oh. No, I don't think so. Okay, try the next question. Maybe Sissy might want to do some writing.
I think that's it for the questions. I don't know if anyone else has anything they want to say. I'm just gonna. Oh, that's a shame. Sissy, if you have a question, do you want to write it in the Q&A and then we can bring up. Here we go. We've got another question. Steve, were there any letters or other communications between these authors that might have made for a more supportive writing milieu? Yeah.
Oh, well, I think Helen Simpson, she was absolutely at the heart of a writing milieu because, as I mentioned, she was a member of the Detection Club because she wrote detective fiction with Clemence Dane, who was a very well-known playwright of the period. And Simpson was pretty close friends with Dorothy L. Sayers. In fact, Dorothy L. Sayers was writing to Simpson just before she died, before Simpson died. Simpson died. She died of breast cancer and she had a very unsuccessful operation in 1940 and died shortly after. And Dorothy L. Sayers, in Dorothy L. Sayers' letters, you will find her mentioning Helen Simpson with great distress because her friend was dying. But apart from that, I mean, Helen was in a very centre of this very active London-centric literary scene. But D.K. Broster, because we simply know so little about her, we have no idea what her writing community was like. I mean, given that her partner, her companion, also published books, clearly they must have talked about writing, or maybe they didn't. Maybe we just don't know. I mean, it's amazing how little we can know.
Yeah, she attended, I do know, and I think I put this in the introduction too, she attended parties hosted by the publisher William Heinemann in London. I did find some photographs, some nice photographs of her. So we know she did, sort of mix in, the writerly community of London, but she moved to the South Coast and, seems to have just been happy and, stayed there.
Yeah, it's I would love to know more about her, but if a woman wants to keep her life private, she certainly does. I can see Sissy actually hit the wrong button and she apologizes for confusing everyone because it is difficult to get the right button sometimes if you don't know what you're doing.
And I should say too, can I say too that D.K. Broster's papers are held at St. Hilda's College at Oxford. So if anyone would like to maybe continue the search, it would be great to I think some people have but yeah, so her papers are there too. It was a little bit with restrictions. It's been a little bit rough. I would love to get over there myself maybe someday and look at her papers, but it's nice to have that collection.
Yeah. And St. Hilda's been very, very welcoming to the anthology we're going to publish.
Very much.
Yeah,
very
they've been really
much.
supportive.
We've had some more questions come
Mhm.
in.
Good.
So let's go to, so Subi, I put the names in there for you of the books and the authors. And Jalisa, I'm thinking of Catherine Morland's State of Horror and Modern Women as the mainstay audience for true crime. Do you have insight into your author's readership?
Ooh.
Mm.
Author's readership, difficult. Given that they were publishing 70, 80, 90, 100 years ago, it's a bit tricky. I mean, the best way you can work out who the authors thought they were publishing for is to see where they were being published themselves. So to go back to the original magazine publishing and see where the K Broster and Helen Simpsons were being placed, with the other stories being published alongside them in those issues, you will get a sense of what the editors of those magazines thought was the market. And the editors are the ones who are going to get it right, because they're putting their money into it. They will not publish a story for an existing market unless they're sure that story will fit that market. Otherwise, they're wasting their money. That is the way I would work backwards.
Yeah, Simpson definitely, I mean, she published for the popular market with her final stories towards the end of her life, the ones that we included from the late 1930s. So she published in Lovett Dixon's and the Tatler. And she also published in some detective, fiction collections. So she was, again, with, Clement Stain and people like that, she was, for some of her writing, she was definitely geared towards, that fans of that type of genre. Maybe it's a little bit, again, Broster, writing for the history, the historical fiction, slight romance, but I wouldn't even put it towards that as much. It's really historical fiction. So writing, for that audience, but her ghost stories complicate that. It's a little bit trickier. She did publish her stories in was it Chambers? Help me, Kate. There's a lot of them were in Chambers
and Macmillan's, and possibly Macmillan's even.
So again, working backwards from, they were collected in 32 and 42 as collections published by Heinemann, but they were the bulk of her stories were also published for the popular market originally in magazines.
So that's the best we can do. Great. Any other questions, Sarah?
Yeah, there is. Steve again, any plans to publish any of these kinds of letters? A volume of them from across the scene would be very interesting. We've got loads of Lovecraft.
Letters. I don't know of any letters. I just don't know. I personally have no plans to do that. Handheld, we've got another anthology coming out in September of archaeological supernatural weird, but we haven't got any more scheduled. Do you know of anything else being anything else on the stocks, Melissa, from different publishers?
Not right off the top of my head. I have my own list in my head, but I don't really have. Again, I hate to list just some, but there are a lot of publishers out there doing good things. Some are hardcover limited editions, so it's a little bit trickier. So I hate to list any because I don't want to leave anyone out. But letters are, to get back to the letters, can be a little tricky because if they're in archives and unpublished, then you have to go through, getting permission. Sometimes they need a fair amount of editing, which can be time consuming. So there are some letters, in the Broster collection at St. Hilda's. Kate, as far as I know, right? Simpsons, there's some letters in collections, but I think her family, who's taken a really, they've been wonderful. We talked about St. Hilda's, and I should just mention that Helen Simpson's family has been very supportive. Her daughter is still living, and so they have some of her papers as well. But again, it's unpublished, so it can be a little tricky, to form those, into a collection.
And frankly, selling collections of letters by unknown authors I would never do that, because they wouldn't sell. Nobody would buy them, or certainly not enough people to make it worth the expense. Have you seen the price of paper at the moment? It's an expensive business. You have to be quite certain of a fair amount of success before you go into publishing these days. So not a positive answer, I'm afraid. Sorry. Next question, Sarah.
Can you share this from Subi? Can you share tips on writing a supernatural short story? And they said thank you. They enjoyed the session.
I'm not a supernatural short story author, but I would always say make the characters really strong and let the characters develop the action of the story. Don't just have a character plonked into a pre-scripted plan. Let the character lead and make the reader jump, but I don't know how you do that. What do you think, Melissa?
Yeah, I cannot. I have no creative writing ability. I much prefer to read other people who do it excellently and just write about them and include their stories.
Yeah.
I mean, but maybe that's kind of a neat thing to think about, though. I haven't really, in all these, talks and book launches that we've done, I still think these collections published, 50, 70, 100 years ago, if you're interested in it, have a look at these stories, because like you said, Kate, they can tell you a lot about how to pace stories. They hold up very well, not some more than others, but the characterization, I think they're excellent examples of how you go about writing a story. But I cannot share personal experience.
Okay, are there any other questions, Sarah?
Yeah, we've got some comments and 2 more questions. So I'll go to the last one because I quickly answer this. So Sulamit said, thank you for an intriguing presentation. They lost sound and they want to know if there's going to be a recording. There is, and we'll send it out to all attendees once it's finished its cycle. Melissa said, just want to seize the opportunity to thank both Kate and Melissa for introducing me to so many authors of weird, new to me, and to stories new to me by familiar ones.
Excellent. Our work is done.
Exactly. That's so good. I just never get tired of hearing that. I never get tired of thank you.
Yeah.
We have an anonymous question for Melissa. Are the US contemporaries of these writers dealing with similar themes, or is it a marked difference between the two?
Yeah, that's a great question too.
That's an enormous question.
That's enormous. Yeah, but I mean, again, I go back to the women's weird that we did. I tried to include some geographic diversity with those, especially in the second volume. I tried to be broader. So I'm thinking of Sarah Oren Jewett, who again, it's really interesting. This again, huge topic. And I know we have time limitations, but a writer who's not known, she wrote regional fiction. She was based in Maine, and she writes these amazing weird stories. So look her up. I think you can find her stories online because she is out of copyright. We have to mention Edith Wharton, right? I mean, that's sort of the big name that comes to mind. Again, maybe a little bit more well known. Her stories are out there. She has been anthologized. She has, her work has, seen modern editions, which is great.
Charlotte Gilman.
Yeah, so I would say, if you haven't checked out Edith Wharton, again, maybe not known for the supernatural, known for her, her novels, her Gilded Age novels and things like that. But yeah, and there are probably others that I'm kind of forgetting about. With North American, Lucy Maud Montgomery, I think, her story that we included in Women's Weird too really surprised a lot of people, because they're like, this is not Anne of Green Gables, this is something more troubling. So, yeah, they're definitely great question, but that's just a few I can think of off the top of my head, but there are definitely more. More.
Sarah, any more?
No, that's it. That's the last question. Okay, we've got some little thank yous coming in, so I'm just going to read them before we actually end the session with you all. Just one moment. Okay, so we have Sharon says, thank you for a very interesting talk. I've heard of K Broster. Her story, Crouching at the Door, is one of my favorites, but I hadn't heard of Helen de Guerry Simpson, and I'm eager to read her work.
Yay, good.
Melissa says, thank you to Westminster Libraries and me for bringing another great handheld session and so many more, which I very much appreciate. Thank you, Melissa.
Mhm.
And Georgie says, thank you for this interesting topic. We will have to see if my local library can get some more for me here in Canada.
Good idea. We do sell in Canada. We have very good reps in Canada. So you should be able to find our books.
And we got some more thank yous for an interesting talk. Steve says, thank you very much. I enjoyed several handheld books and look forward to many more.
Excellent.
And we have, I've got a long digit number, but they're asking, can you send the website again? Okay.
So, yeah, it's www.handheldpress.co.uk. And I think actually, Sarah, when you send the video out, you could put that in the text of the email.
Yep, that's fine. I've also replied to them so they can see
Okay,
it.
good. That's good. Yeah.
It was at co.uk, you said?
.co.uk, yeah.
Brilliant. Okay, thank you. Well, I'm going to start wrapping up now, everyone. Thank you for attending our talk event, Women Writers and Supernatural Short Stories. I want to thank Melissa for being our guest speaker. And I want to thank Kate again for introducing us to a whole new genre of books that personally I've never really heard of. And so
because I have to educate you, Sarah.
Exactly.
Every time you say this, I've never really heard these people.
I know. Educate me, educate. I'm happy. I'm very happy. So just quick last thing to everyone. Yes, you'll get a copy of this recording. I will also make sure I put the link into Kate's website for you. And I'll also list the authors that we talked about and their books. So thank you for joining us. And I'm just going to sign us all out now. Goodbye, everyone.
Bye.